For nearly 2,000 years, one name has been whispered with disgust, carved into sermons as a warning, burned into the collective memory of Western faith as the face of betrayal. Judas Iscariot. The man who sold God for silver, the traitor who sealed the fate of Jesus Christ. A villain so absolute that his name itself became a curse. But imagine this. Imagine if Judas did not betray Jesus at all. Imagine if he was not the enemy, but the chosen one. Imagine if the most hated man in Christian history was following orders. And imagine the consequence of that possibility. If Judas obeyed Jesus, then the crucifixion was not a tragedy. It was a plan. And if that is true, then the story the world has been told for centuries does not merely bend, it collapses. This is not a reinterpretation. This is not a metaphor. This is a forbidden text, buried, condemned, erased. Because its existence threatens the moral foundation of the Bible itself. A gospel that does not praise the faithful, but mocks them. A gospel that does not glorify sacrifice, but exposes manipulation. A gospel that dares to say that salvation came not through obedience, but through betrayal. This is the Gospel of Judas. And once you understand what it claims, you cannot unknow it. The story does not begin with Judas as a villain. It begins with him as the only disciple who truly listens. While the others kneel, worship, misunderstand, and cling to rituals, Judas watches. He notices the contradictions. He hears what Jesus says when the crowd is gone. In this gospel, Jesus laughs, not gently, not kindly, but with contempt. He laughs at the disciples' prayers. He laughs at their sacrifices. He tells them they worship the wrong God. He tells them they do not understand him, and worse, they never will. Except one, Judas. Jesus pulls him aside, away from the others, and tells him a secret so heavy it would destroy anyone who heard it unprepared. Jesus explains that his physical body is a prison, that the flesh is a mistake, that the true divine cannot be freed unless this body is destroyed. And then he gives Judas a command that damns him forever in the eyes of humanity. You will exceed all of them, Jesus tells him, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. This is not betrayal. This is execution by consent. Judas is not tempted by silver here. He is burdened by knowledge. He understands that someone must be hated so the plan can succeed, and that someone will be him. The other disciples are spared this role. They will be remembered as saints. Judas will be remembered as a monster. And Jesus knows this. He allows it. He chooses it. That is the most disturbing part. In this version of the story, evil is not an accident. It is assigned. Judas becomes the necessary villain, the tool through which salvation is engineered. The kiss in the garden is not an act of greed. It is a signal, a final confirmation that the plan is moving forward. And the moment Judas does what he was told, history brands him as the ultimate traitor, while the truth is buried alongside this gospel, hidden because it asks a question too dangerous for the faithful to face. What kind of God requires someone to be eternally condemned in order for others to be saved? What makes this text truly dangerous is not that it redeems Judas, but that it condemns almost everyone else. In the Gospel of Judas, the other disciples are not heroes. They are blind. They pray, they perform rituals, They offer sacrifices, and Jesus responds with ridicule. He tells them their worship feeds a false god. He tells them their altars are built on ignorance. He tells them they think they are chosen, but they are not. This is not subtle. This is an attack. The gospel flips the moral hierarchy upside down and exposes a terrifying idea: that devotion does not equal understanding. The disciples believe they are serving God, yet Jesus says they are trapped in a system that rewards obedience, not truth. Salvation in this worldview does not belong to the many. It belongs to the few who can endure knowledge without flinching. Judas is isolated not because he is evil, but because he is capable of hearing what would break the others. The text strips away comfort and replaces it with cosmic indifference. Souls are sorted. Most are discarded. The kingdom of heaven is not open to all, only to those who escape the illusion of the physical world. This is why the gospel could never be tolerated. It does not offer hope through faith. It offers escape through understanding. And worse, it implies that the institutions built on mass belief are not just mistaken, but complicit in preserving a lie.
A text like this could not survive in the open. It dismantles the emotional architecture of Christianity piece by piece. If Judas was acting on Jesus' command, then sin becomes strategy. If the disciples were wrong, then authority becomes suspect. If salvation is reserved for a hidden few, then the church's promise to the masses becomes a dangerous illusion. This gospel does not need to declare war on doctrine. Its existence alone is enough. That is why it was condemned as heresy. That is why it vanished for centuries, not burned publicly, but erased quietly, forgotten deliberately. Because once believers encounter a Jesus who laughs at prayer, a Savior who orchestrates his own betrayal, and a God who requires a villain to complete his design, the moral clarity dissolves, responsibility blurs, obedience loses its innocence. The faithful are left with an unbearable question: were we following truth, or were we following a story designed to keep us in place? The Gospel of Judas does not ask to replace the Bible. It asks something far more destructive. It asks the reader to sit with uncertainty, to accept that good and evil may not be opposites, but collaborators. And institutions built on certainty cannot survive that kind of doubt. Once the Gospel of Judas is read as a story rather than a relic, the damage begins quietly. It does not scream, it corrodes. It plants a doubt that refuses to leave. If Judas was chosen to be hated, then morality is no longer clean. If evil can be assigned for a greater design, then responsibility fractures. The believer is left staring at an uncomfortable reflection. What if obedience is not virtue, but convenience? What if faith, as practiced by the masses, is not a path to truth, but a shelter from fear? This gospel suggests that most people are not saved because they are faithful, but because they are useful. They believe, they obey, they reinforce the structure, and in return, they are promised meaning. Judas receives no such comfort. He receives clarity, and clarity costs him everything. In this story, Judas does not misunderstand Jesus. He understands him too well. He understands that someone must carry the weight of blame so others can sleep at night believing evil has a single face. The psychological consequence of this idea is brutal. It forces the reader to question every moral villain history has conveniently isolated. It asks whether societies require monsters in order to preserve their own innocence. And once that thought takes hold, it spreads beyond religion. It infects politics. It infects power. It infects the way humans excuse cruelty by calling it necessity. The Gospel of Judas stops being a religious text at that point. It becomes a mirror. And mirrors are dangerous when people are not ready to see themselves.
Today, the Gospel of Judas is no longer hidden underground, yet it remains carefully contained. It is discussed academically, framed as heresy, softened as mythology, stripped of its emotional teeth. Not because it has been disproven, but because its implications are inconvenient. Official doctrine does not need to refute it. It only needs to neutralize it. Because if believers begin to imagine a Jesus who designs betrayal, a salvation that requires a scapegoat, and a truth reserved for those willing to be hated, the entire emotional economy of faith shifts. The cross no longer represents pure sacrifice. It represents calculation. Judas no longer represents simple evil. He represents the cost of truth in a world that prefers comfort. And the most unsettling realization arrives last, quietly, without drama. If this gospel is false, it is still dangerous. And if it is true, then history's greatest betrayal was not Judas's kiss, but the decision to erase his voice and let humanity believe that good and evil are always easy to separate. The Gospel of Judas does not ask to be believed. It only asks to be read. And once it is, it leaves behind a silence where certainty used to live.